The trustee didn't slide the documents across the table. He just looked at me and asked quietly, "Selena, did anyone ever ask you to give up your share?" I remember freezing, because as far as I knew, there was never a share to give up. My brother Marcus had always been the one who got Grandpa's $850,000 trust. That's what my parents told me. That's what everyone in the family believed. So why was there a signed document with my name on it? And why didn't I remember signing it? Mr. Halpern pushed a sealed envelope toward me. "You should see this for yourself." When I opened it, my own signature stared back at me, perfect, unmistakable, and completely foreign. If you're watching this from outside the US, tell me where you're from and what time it is there right now. I'm in Chicago, and it was exactly 3:17 p.m. when I realized something in my family's story didn't add up. And if you've ever been told something was for the family, but it cost you everything, you might want to stay with me on this one. 10 years ago, when my grandfather Charles Boyd died, the house felt quieter than it ever had, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that comes from people carefully choosing what not to say. I was 22, finishing my last year of college in Columbus, juggling a part-time job at a small accounting firm and a full course load. I remember rushing home that weekend, still wearing the same blazer I'd worn to a client meeting because my mom said family needs to be together right now. Marcus was already there. He was 18 then, still figuring out what he wanted to do, but somehow he looked relieved. Not grieving, not even unsettled. Just steady in a way I couldn't explain at the time. My mom Denise hugged me tight when I walked in. "You made it," she said, like I'd just crossed something difficult. My dad Harold gave me a nod from the living room. He was already talking to someone on the phone, his voice low, controlled. I caught a few words as I walked past timeline asset structure, the kind of language I would later understand professionally, but back then I just assumed it was part of handling an estate. We never sat down as a family to talk about Grandpa's wishes. Instead, everything came in fragments. A comment here, a reassurance there. He set things up to help where it's most needed, my mom told me one night while we stood in the kitchen. "And you know your brother's still finding his footing," my dad added from behind her. I remember nodding. Not because I fully agreed, but because I didn't feel like I had the full picture, and when you don't have the full picture, it's easier to trust the people who claim they do. Marcus got quieter over the next few weeks, but in a focused way. He started talking about plans, about maybe starting a small business, about finally having room to figure things out. At the time, I thought it was optimism. Looking back, it sounded like certainty. Meanwhile, my life didn't change much. I kept working, kept studying, kept pushing towards something stable. No one ever sat me down and said, "Selena, here's what Grandpa left you." That conversation just never happened. And I didn't ask. That part still bothers me. A few weeks after the funeral, my dad called me into the dining room one evening. "Hey," he said, sliding a small stack of papers across the table. "We just need your signature on a few estate documents. Routine stuff so everything can be finalized." I remember glancing at the top page. It was dense. Legal language, paragraphs that blurred together after a long day. "What is it exactly?" I asked. "Administrative," he said quickly. "Just confirms you're aware of how things are being distributed. Nothing complicated." My mom stood near the doorway, arms folded but smiling. "We've already gone through everything with the attorney. This is just the last step." There was something about the way they said it, calm, rehearsed, that made it feel like the decision had already been made somewhere else. I picked up the pen. "Do I need to read all of this?" I asked, half joking. "You can if you want," my dad said, already turning slightly away, but it's standard. Standard. That word has a way of lowering your guard. I signed the first page, then the second. I don't remember how many there were. 3, 4. Maybe more. What I do remember is how fast it felt. Too fast for something that involved my grandfather's entire estate. At one point I paused. There was a page that looked slightly different formatting, didn't quite match the others. The spacing was tighter. The text felt more condensed. "Is this part of the same thing I asked?" My dad glanced over just for a second. "Yeah, it's all bundled together." My mom added, "It just looks different because it came from a different department." I nodded again. "Signed." And that was it. No copies handed to me. No follow-up conversation. No explanation afterward. Just done. Within a month, Marcus had access to funds that changed his life. He upgraded everything, his laptop. His car even started talking about putting money down on a small property with a friend. When I asked him about it once, he shrugged. "Grandpa wanted me to have a chance," he said. I remember that exact sentence because it stuck with me. Not because it was unfair, but because it felt incomplete. Like there was a second half no one was saying out loud. Years passed. I built my career, became a CPA, moved to Chicago, learned how money actually moves, how trusts are structured, how signatures matter. But I never once went back to question that night. Not until I was sitting in that office again 10 years later, staring at a document labeled Irrevocable Disclaimer of Beneficial Interest, with my name on it, with my signature. And suddenly that quiet moment at the dining table didn't feel routine anymore. It felt like the most important decision I'd ever made. One I didn't even realize I was making. Back in my Chicago apartment, I spread the copies across my dining table the same way my dad had done 10 years earlier. Except this time I read every line. Not like a daughter trusting her parents. Like a CPA who knows exactly how much damage a single document can do. The title alone was enough to shift everything. Irrevocable Disclaimer of Beneficial Interest. Irrevocable, meaning permanent. Final. No undoing it just because you regret it later. I sat down slowly, my chest tightening as I traced the language with my finger. The document stated that I, Selena Boyd, was voluntarily declining any and all rights to assets, funds, or distributions from the Charles Boyd Trust. It even included a clause confirming that I had been given adequate time to review and had chosen not to seek independent legal advice. I let out a quiet laugh. Adequate time. I could still see that dining room in my mind, my dad standing already half turned away, my mom watching from the doorway like everything was already settled. I flipped to the signature page. There it was again. My name, my handwriting, the date. I leaned closer. Something felt off. Not the signature itself, it was mine, but the placement. In properly structured legal documents, signature blocks are aligned consistently. Page numbering is standardized. Sections flow in sequence. This one didn't. The signature page looked like it belonged to a different document entirely. The margins were slightly narrower, the spacing between lines tighter. Even the font weight felt inconsistent. "Okay," I murmured to myself. "That's not normal." I grabbed my laptop and opened a blank document recreating the formatting from memory. Then I compared it side by side with the scanned copy Halpern had given me. The difference wasn't dramatic enough for someone untrained to notice, but it was enough. "Selena, you're not imagining this," I said out loud. I kept going. The timestamp. That's when my stomach dropped. The document was dated October 14th. I pulled up my old calendar. Archive one of those habits I'd never broken. Every appointment, every shift, every doctor visit had been logged. October 14th. There it was. A 10:30 a.m. appointment at Riverside Clinic. I remembered that week, vaguely constant headaches, no sleep anxiety that wouldn't settle. I'd finally gone in after nearly passing out during a shift. I clicked deeper into my archived notes. Prescribed low-dose anxiolytic. Advised rest. Patient reports difficulty concentrating. I leaned back in my chair. Difficulty concentrating. At 1:15 p.m. that same day, there was another entry I hadn't thought about in years. Dad picking me up home. I closed my eyes for a second. He hadn't asked. He told me. "I'll come get you after your appointment," he'd said over the phone. "We'll take care of a few things." At the time, I thought he meant groceries. Or maybe just getting me settled. I didn't think it meant legal documents. I went back to the disclaimer. The signing time listed was 2:05 p.m., less than an hour after that appointment. Of course, I whispered. Of course it happened that day. I flipped through the rest of the packet again, slower this time. That's when I found it. Page 3. Or what was labeled as page 3. Except, it didn't actually say 3. The footer read 3A. I frowned. There's no such thing as a 3A page in a finalized legal document unless it's been inserted later or pulled from a separate file. I scanned the content. It was a short clause. Dense. Easy to overlook. It explicitly referenced the disclaimer and reaffirmed that I understood I was giving up any future claims, challenges, or disputes related to the trust. But the language didn't match the rest of the document. It was more aggressive, more protective of the trust, not of me. Why would this be separate? I muttered. I checked the metadata on the PDF Halpern had emailed me. Creation dates, file names. There were 2 distinct timestamps. The main document had been created on October 10th. Page 3A, October 13th. The day before I signed, I felt something cold settle in my chest. That page wasn't part of the original document. It was added, deliberately, and I had signed anyway, or more accurately, I had been guided to sign without ever realizing what I was agreeing to. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of the spiral. It was Maya. "You okay?" she texted. "You went quiet after the meeting." I stared at the message for a second before typing back. "I think my parents had me sign away $850K while I was medicated." There was a pause. Then my phone rang. I picked up immediately. Selena Maya said, her voice sharp, now focused. "Tell me exactly what you're seeing." I walked her through everything, the mismatched formatting, the extra page, the timing with the clinic visit. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then she said, "That's not just sloppy paperwork." "I know. That's controlled." I swallowed. "Yeah." Another pause. "Do you have anything that proves you weren't in a condition to review or understand what you signed?" she asked. I glanced at my screen again at the note from the clinic. "Maybe." "Then you need to get your medical records," she said. "Full records, not summaries." "I can do that." "And Selena." "Yeah." "Don't confront them again yet." I hesitated. Too late for that, I thought. But I didn't say it. Why, I asked instead. "Because if this is what it looks like," she said carefully, "you're not dealing with a misunderstanding." I felt my grip tighten on the phone. "You're dealing with intent." I hung up a few minutes later, the room feeling smaller than it had before. I looked back down at the document. At my name. At my signature. At page 3A. And for the first time since walking into Halpern's office, I wasn't just confused. I was certain of one thing. That signature didn't tell the whole story. And somewhere between that clinic visit and my dad's dining room table, someone had made sure I wouldn't ask questions. The records department at Riverside Clinic still used the same beige filing system I remembered from 10 years ago. That alone made me uneasy. Places that never update anything tend to hold on to everything. "I'll need a full release form," the receptionist said, sliding a clipboard toward me. "Not just a summary. Full chart access takes a bit longer." "That's fine," I said. "I need everything from October 2014, notes, prescriptions, intake forms. All of it." She glanced at me for a second, like she could tell this wasn't casual curiosity. Then she nodded. "Give me a few hours." I didn't leave. I sat in the waiting area watching patients come and go, trying to ignore the steady pressure building in my chest. Every now and then, I caught fragments of conversation, someone asking about lab results, someone else scheduling a follow-up, and it all felt strangely distant. 10 years ago, I had been one of them. Tired, overworked, not paying attention to the right things. When they finally called my name, I followed a nurse down a short hallway and into a small consultation room. She handed me a thick folder. "Some of this is handwritten," she said. "Let me know if you need help interpreting anything." I thanked her and closed the door behind me. For a moment, I just stared at the folder. Then I opened it. The first few pages were standard intake forms, my handwriting shaky but legible. Symptoms listed in bullet points: headaches, insomnia, anxiety, trouble focusing.
Nothing surprising.
Then I turned to the physician's notes. Patient appears fatigued. Reports high stress related to school and work. Mild disorientation noted during intake conversation.
I read that line twice.
Mild disorientation. I flipped to the next page.
Prescribed low-dose benzodiazepine.
Advised limited decision-making until symptoms stabilize. I stopped breathing for a second. Limited decision-making. That wasn't vague. That was direct. I kept going. There was a timestamp, 11:12 a.m. That's when the medication was administered. Below it, another note. Patient advised to avoid signing legal or financial documents within 24 hours. I closed my eyes.
Just for a second.
Because suddenly everything lined up too cleanly.
My appointment ended around noon.
My dad picked me up shortly after. And by 2:05 p.m., I had signed away my rights to a trust worth $850,000. I let out a slow breath and leaned back in the chair. That's not coincidence, I whispered. That's timing.
Careful timing.
I flipped further into the file looking for anything else.
That's when I found the intake signature page. My signature again, but this one was different.
Slightly uneven, a little heavier on the downstrokes. The kind of variation you get when your hands aren't fully steady. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo I'd taken of the disclaimer earlier. 2 signatures.
Same name, but not the same control.
Okay, I said quietly. Okay. I wasn't a handwriting expert, but I didn't need to be. I knew my own signature. I knew how it looked when I was focused and how it looked when I wasn't. And the version on the disclaimer,
it was too clean, too precise.
I turned back to the doctor's notes, scanning more carefully this time. Near the bottom of the page, there was a brief line I almost missed. Patient accompanied by family member post-visit.
No name, just that.
I sat up straighter, because I remembered that moment now. Not clearly, but enough. The parking lot, the sharp brightness of the afternoon sun. My dad standing next to the car, one hand already on the door like he'd been waiting for a while.
You ready? He'd asked.
I remember nodding. I also remember not asking where we were going.
That part stuck with me now.
Because I always ask questions. It's part of who I am. It's what made me good at my job.
But that day, I didn't.
I flipped back through the file again, slower this time, looking for anything I might have overlooked. And then I found it. A small attached document clipped to the back.
Release acknowledgement.
It confirmed that I had been informed of the medication's effects and had acknowledged understanding them. There was a signature line at the bottom. My name was printed, but the signature, it was blank. I frowned. That didn't make sense. If I had been properly informed and had acknowledged it, there should have been a signature there. Instead, it was empty. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I compared it again to the disclaimer, to page 3A, to the perfectly placed signature that carried legal weight. Something about that contrast made my stomach turn, because it suggested something simple. I hadn't signed the one document meant to protect me, but I had signed the one that gave everything away. I closed the folder slowly, my hands steady now, in a way they hadn't been when I walked in. When I stepped back into the hallway, the nurse looked up. Did you find what you needed? I held the folder a little tighter. Yes, I said. More than I wanted to. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. I stood there for a minute, replaying the timeline again in my head. Medication at 11:12. Warning about decision-making. No signed acknowledgement of that warning.
Pick up by my dad.
Then paperwork. Fast, clean, final. I pulled out my phone and opened my messages.
Scrolled down. Found my mom's contact.
For a second, I hovered over it. Then I locked my screen instead. Maya's voice echoed in my head. Don't confront them yet. She was right. Because this wasn't just about what happened anymore. It was about proving it. And proving it meant building something stronger than memory. Something stronger than emotion. I looked down at the folder in my hands, at the notes, the timestamps, the missing signature. And for the first time since this started, I felt something shift. Not confusion,
not anger,
clarity. If they had planned this the way it looked, then they had counted on one thing, that I would never go back and check. They were wrong, and now I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go to keep this buried. Because if the timing was intentional, Then the signing wasn't the only thing that had been controlled. I didn't call them. Not that day. Not the next. For almost a week, I sat with everything documents spread across my dining table, notes from the clinic clipped neatly to the side, timestamps highlighted like they were part of an audit. Because that's what this had become, an audit of my own life. I built a timeline the same way I would for a client under review, clean, structured, impossible to argue with.
October 14th, 11:12 a.m. medication administered. 11:30-12:00 p.m. consultation notes. Limited focus. Avoid legal decisions. 1:15 p.m. my dad picks me up. 2:05 p.m. I sign the disclaimer. Then I added a second column. October 10th main trust document created. October 13th page 3A added. October 14th I sign. I stared at the pattern for a long time. It wasn't random. It was sequence. Deliberate, controlled sequence. I finally called my parents the following Sunday. "Can we talk?" I asked. My mom hesitated just for a second. "Of course. Come by for dinner." Of course. Dinner. Like we were still the kind of family that solved things over roast chicken and polite conversation. I drove down to Columbus that afternoon, the same route I'd taken 100 times before. Nothing about the house had changed, the same trimmed hedges, the same porch light that always seemed a little too dim. But everything felt different. I walked in without knocking. My mom was in the kitchen. My dad was already seated at the dining table. Marcus was there too. That surprised me. No one said anything about it. "Hi," I said, setting my bag down slowly. "Hi, sweetheart," my mom replied, her voice too careful. I didn't sit. Instead, I pulled the documents out of my bag and placed them on the table. "Can someone explain this to me?" I asked. My dad didn't look at the papers right away. "What is it?" he said. "You know what it is." That got his attention. He picked up the top page, skimmed it, then set it back down like it didn't matter. "That's the disclaimer you signed," he said calmly. "We've been over this." "No," I said, my voice steady. "We haven't." My mom stepped closer. "Selena, we told you back then. You told me it was routine paperwork I cut in. You didn't tell me I was signing away my share of Grandpa's trust." My dad leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me now. "You didn't have a share," he said. I felt something tighten in my chest. "That's not what this says." He shrugged. "It's legal language. It doesn't mean what you think it means." I almost laughed. I'm a CPA dad. I know exactly what it means. That shifted something in the room. Marcus looked down at his hands. My mom crossed her arms. "You're overcomplicating this," she said. "We made a decision as a family." "No," I said quietly. "You made a decision. And then you had me sign something without explaining it." "That's not true," my dad snapped. "You agreed. When I asked." He opened his mouth, then paused. "Back then," he said finally, "you understood the situation. Marcus needed the help more than you did." I nodded slowly. "Right. Because I was stable. Because I land on my feet." No one responded. I slid another document across the table, the clinic notes. "Do you remember this day?" I asked. My mom glanced at it, then away. "I don't see what that has to do with anything." "It has everything to do with it," I said. I was medicated that morning. I was advised not to make legal decisions, and then Dad picked me up and had me sign these. Silence. Heavy, uncomfortable silence. My dad exhaled sharply. "You're twisting this." "Am I?" I tapped the timestamp with my finger. 2:05 p.m. That's when I signed. Less than an hour after I left the clinic. "You were fine," he said. "You don't get to decide that." My mom stepped in, then her voice softer but more controlled. "Selena, she said you didn't want the responsibility. You said that yourself." I stared at her. "When did I say that?" She hesitated. You implied it. You were focused on your career. You didn't want to deal with managing money like that." "That's not the same as giving it away." "It was the same to us," she said. There it was. Not misunderstanding. Interpretation. Convenient interpretation. I turned to Marcus. "Did you know I asked?" He didn't answer right away. "Marcus." He rubbed his hands together, then finally looked up. "I knew there was a trust," he said, quietly. "Before I signed anything." He nodded. A sharp, hollow feeling spread through my chest.
And you didn't think to tell me. They said you already agreed, he said, that it was your decision. I let out a slow breath. Of course they did. Of course that was the story. I looked back at my parents. You told him I agreed. It was easier that way, my mom said. The words landed harder than anything else. Easier. Not right. Not honest. Easier. For who I asked. Neither of them answered. My dad finally leaned forward, his tone shifting firmer now, almost defensive. Look, he said, what's done is done. That money helped your brother build something. You've done just fine on your own. I held his gaze. This isn't about whether I'm fine. Then what is it about? I paused for a second, because I needed them to hear this clearly. It's about the fact that you made a decision that wasn't yours to make, I said. And then you made sure I couldn't question it. My mom shook her head. That's not what happened. I slid one last page onto the table. Page 3A. This was added the day before I signed, I said. It wasn't part of the original document. My dad's eyes flicked to it just for a second. But it was enough. You told me it was all the same paperwork, I continued. It wasn't. He didn't respond. And that silence told me more than anything he could have said. I gathered the papers, slowly stacking them back into order. No one tried to stop me. No one apologized. Marcus looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. As I picked up my bag, my mom spoke again. Selena, she said, don't do something you'll regret. I turned toward her. I think we're a little late for that. I walked out without another word. The drive back to Chicago felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because something had shifted permanently. They weren't going to admit it. They weren't going to fix it. And they definitely weren't going to give anything back willingly. I pulled into my building's garage and sat in the car for a moment, staring at the folder in my lap. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even just manipulation. It was a plan. And now I had to decide what to do with that, because proving it would mean going further than I had so far. And once I did that, there would be no going back to whatever version of family we had left. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, because I was thinking. There's a difference. Anger burns fast. It pushes you to react, to confront, to say things you can't take back. Thinking is quieter, slower. It builds something. And by morning, I knew exactly where to look next. If my dad had been involved in changing anything about that trust, especially something as specific as adding a page like 3A, there had to be communication. No one makes those kinds of adjustments in isolation, especially not when money is involved. I logged into my old email account first. It took me 3 tries to remember the password. The interface hadn't changed much, just older, cluttered like a version of my life I hadn't visited in years. I searched for anything with Boyd Trust Estate Advisor, even just my grandfather's name. At first, nothing. Then I adjusted the filters, broader terms, wider date range. And that's when the results started to appear. Threads I didn't remember reading. Messages I had been copied on, but never opened. I clicked one at random. From Thomas Greer, Financial Advisor, to Harold Boyd, CC Selena Boyd. Date October 11th. Subject distribution structure confirmation. Harold, based on your request, we can proceed with adjusting the beneficiary allocation, but we will need formal acknowledgement from all named parties. I stopped reading. Adjusted allocation. Not finalized. Not predetermined. Adjusted. I scrolled further. Another email. October 12th. From Thomas Greer to Harold Boyd. CC Selena Boyd. Please confirm whether Selena will be declining her portion voluntarily or if we should prepare a standard disclaimer form for her signature. I leaned back in my chair. There it was. Not something I had chosen. Something they had planned. I opened the next message. This one didn't include me. From Harold Boyd to Thomas Greer. Date October 12th. She understands the situation. Go ahead and prepare whatever is needed. We'll have it signed this week. My jaw tightened. She understands. That's what he told them. Not she agreed. Not she requested. She understands. I kept scrolling. October 13th. From Thomas Greer to Harold Boyd, I've attached the revised disclaimer language to ensure no future disputes. Please review before execution. Attachment.
Revised disclaimer language. Page 3A. I didn't even need to open it to know. But I did anyway.
The file name was different from the main document. Addendum. Disclaimer protection. Dockings.
Protection. Not for me. For them.
I opened the attachment and scanned the contents.
The wording matched page 3A almost exactly. Tight defensive designed to close every possible door. No future claims. No challenges.
No ambiguity.
Just finality. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't speculation anymore.
This was a paper trail. I forwarded the entire thread to my current email, then sat back and stared at the screen.
My phone buzzed. Maya again. Did you find anything she texted?
I hesitated for a second, then called her.
Yeah, I said as soon as she picked up. I found everything. Talk to me.
I walked her through the emails, the advisor, the timeline, the addendum, my dad's response.
She didn't interrupt.
When I finished, she let out a low whistle.
That's coordination, she said.
Yeah. That's not just a misunderstanding or bad communication. That's a deliberate setup.
I rubbed my temple. I know. Do you have copies of all of it?
I forwarded everything.
Good, she said.
Because this changes your position.
How?
Before it was your word against theirs. Now you have documentation showing intent.
Intent. That word again. And intent matters, she continued, especially if you're arguing that you were misled or pressured.
I stood up and walked over to the window looking out at the city. So what does that mean? I asked.
It means you don't go back to them again, she said. You take this to Halpern.
I nodded slowly.
That's what I was thinking.
And Selena?
Yeah.
You need to be prepared for this to get ugly. I let out a quiet breath.
It already is.
No, she said gently. This is still contained. Once you bring this into a legal setting, it becomes real. For everyone. I knew what she meant.
Reputation, relationships, lines that couldn't be uncrossed.
Do it anyway, she added. That surprised me.
You're sure?
Yeah, she said. Because if you don't, they get away with it.
And you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what really happened.
I looked back at my laptop.
At the emails.
At my dad's words. She understands.
No, I said quietly. I won't. I ended the call a few minutes later and gathered everything, documents, medical records, email, printouts into one folder. Clean, organized, structured. The way evidence should be. By the time I walked into Halpern's office the next morning, I wasn't the same person who had sat across from him a week earlier. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't even asking questions. I was presenting a case. He looked up as I stepped inside, then gestured toward the chair. Selena, he said, I had a feeling you'd be back. I sat down and placed the folder on his desk.
I need you to look at this, I said. He opened it slowly, scanning the first few pages. His expression didn't change, not at first. Then he reached the emails, and that's when I saw it. A subtle shift. His posture straightened. His eyes narrowed slightly. He read more carefully now, more slowly. When he finally looked up, his tone had changed.
Where did you get these? My old email account.
He nodded once.
Good.
That was all he said.
Good. Not surprising.
Not unclear.
Good.
Because it confirmed what I was already starting to understand. This wasn't just something that felt wrong anymore.
It was something that could be challenged. Legally.
Halpern closed the folder and rested his hand on top of it. You have enough here, he said, to raise serious questions about how that disclaimer was obtained. My pulse picked up slightly.
Questions or a case?
He held my gaze for a moment before answering. That depends on what you're willing to do next. I didn't respond right away, because I already knew the answer, but saying it out loud would make it real. What does that involve? I asked. He leaned back slightly in his chair.
It means formally contesting the validity of the disclaimer, he said, which also means...
He paused. You're opening a dispute against your family. The words hung in the air between us.
Clear, final, no way to soften them.
I felt the weight of it settle in.
Not just the legal side, the personal cost, the consequences that wouldn't show up in any document.
I looked down at the folder for a second.
At the timeline I had built, at the signatures, at the emails.
Then I looked back up at him.
I'm not asking them again, I said.
He nodded.
Then the question is simple.
He tapped the folder lightly. Do you want to move forward with this? I held his gaze, and for the first time since this started, there was no hesitation. Yes, I said. He gave a small measured nod. All right, he replied. Then we proceed. He reached for a pen, already turning to a fresh sheet of paper. Because once we file this, he looked up at me one more time. They won't be able to pretend it didn't happen anymore. Filing the case didn't feel dramatic. There was no moment where everything shifted all at once. No raised voices, no visible consequences. Just paperwork. Precise, controlled, deliberate paperwork, which somehow made it heavier. Mr. Halpern didn't rush anything. He walked me through each step, not like a lawyer trying to win, but like someone making sure I understood exactly what I was choosing. We're not arguing about the existence of the signature, he said, tapping the copy of the disclaimer. That part is clear. I know. We're arguing about the conditions under which it was obtained. I nodded. Medication, timing, omission, the added page. All of it. And intent, he added. Intent is what connects everything you found. That word again. Intent. He slid a document toward me. Petition to challenge the validity of the disclaimer, he said. This formally opens the dispute. I read the first paragraph, slowly letting the language settle in. It didn't sound emotional. It didn't sound personal. It sounded factual, which somehow made it more powerful. This will notify your parents and your brother, he continued, and it will trigger a response. They'll have the opportunity to defend their position. I looked up. They will, I said quietly. Almost certainly. I signed. This time I read every line, every clause, every implication. When I handed the document back, something inside me shifted. Not relief, not satisfaction, just certainty. It was done, and the response came faster than I expected. 3 days. That's all it took. Halpern called me into his office that afternoon. They've retained counsel, he said, handing me a neatly printed packet. Of course they had. I sat down and flipped through the pages. The tone was exactly what I expected. Firm, controlled, dismissive. Their position was simple. I had signed voluntarily. I had been informed. I had chosen not to pursue independent legal advice. The distribution had been executed accordingly. No mention of the clinic. No mention of timing. No mention of page 3A. Just a clean narrative. One that made them look reasonable. And me look reactive. They're framing this as a misunderstanding, I said, closing the packet. Halpern nodded. That's standard. They're not denying anything directly. They won't, he said. Not unless they have to. I leaned back slightly, processing. So we make them, I said. That earned a small, almost approving look from him. Yes, he said. That's exactly what we do. They? The first formal meeting wasn't in a courtroom. It was a conference room. Neutral space. Long table. Too much glass. My parents arrived together. Marcus came separately. That detail didn't escape me. My mom, Denise, looked composed, carefully so. My dad had that same controlled expression he'd used my entire life whenever something threatened his sense of order. Marcus avoided my eyes. No one spoke to me before we sat down, which was fine. I wasn't here for conversation. I was here for clarity. Their attorney, a man named Collins, started first. Let's keep this productive, he said smoothly. We're here to resolve a disagreement, not escalate it. Halpern didn't respond. He just gestured for me to stay focused. Collins continued. Our position is straightforward. Ms. Boyd signed a valid disclaimer. The trust was distributed accordingly. There was no coercion. No coercion. The words hung there neat and clean. I didn't react. Halpern opened the folder in front of him. Then let's walk through the timeline, he said. That was my cue. I slid the printed chart across the table. Dates, times, events, organized, structured. Impossible to ignore. My dad didn't touch it. My mom glanced at it briefly, then looked away. Marcus stared at it longer than either of them. Halpern spoke calmly. On October 14th, Selena Boyd was administered medication that, according to medical records, impaired her ability to make informed decisions. Collins raised a hand slightly. That's your interpretation. It's documented, Halpern replied. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to.
I added the next piece. My father picked me up less than an hour after that appointment, I said. And I signed the disclaimer at 2:05 p.m. Collins nodded once like he'd expected that. Even if that's accurate, he said it doesn't invalidate the signature. Halpern slid another document forward. The email chain. This might, he said. Collins's expression shifted just slightly. He picked up the pages, scanning them quickly at first, then more carefully. Silence settled over the table. The kind that doesn't feel empty. It feels loaded. Adjustment of beneficiary allocation, Halpern said almost casually, prepared before the disclaimer was signed. No one from my family spoke. Prepared with the assumption that Selena Boyd would decline her share, he continued. My dad's jaw tightened. My mom looked down at her hands. Marcus exhaled slowly. Collins set the papers down. That doesn't prove coercion, he said, but his tone had changed. No, Halpern agreed, but it proves intent to structure the outcome before obtaining consent. There it was, laid out clearly. Not emotional, not dramatic, just undeniable. I watched my dad then, really watched him. For the first time since this started, he didn't look in control. He looked calculating, like he was trying to figure out which version of the story still worked. That email is being taken out of context, he said finally. Then provide the context, Halpern replied. Silence. Longer this time. My mom shifted in her seat. Selena, she said softly, we did what we thought was best. I didn't respond, because that wasn't the conversation anymore. This wasn't about intentions in the abstract. It was about actions, documents, decisions, and the space between what they said and what they actually did. Marcus cleared his throat. I think we should take a break, he said. Collins glanced at him, then nodded. That might be wise. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. People stood, but nothing felt resolved. Not even close. As I stepped out into the hallway, I felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not doubt, not anger, pressure. The kind that builds right before something changes. Because for the first time, their version of the story wasn't holding, and they knew it. Marcus caught up to me just as I reached the elevator. Selena, he said. I turned. He looked different. Not defensive, not confident, just uncertain. Can we talk, he asked. I studied him for a second, then nodded. Not here, I said. He agreed. And as the elevator doors opened, I realized something had shifted again. Not in the documents, not in the case, in him, which meant whatever came next. Wasn't going to stay contained inside that conference room. We met later that evening at a small coffee shop a few blocks from the conference building. It wasn't somewhere either of us had been before. Neutral ground. No history. No expectations. Marcus was already there when I walked in, sitting at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't touched. He looked up when he saw me, then stood like he wasn't sure whether to hug me or keep his distance. He chose distance. Thanks for coming, he said. I nodded and sat across from him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The kind of silence that used to feel comfortable between us now felt like something fragile we didn't know how to handle. You look tired, he said finally. I am. That was the simplest truth I had. He nodded like he expected that. I didn't know it was like this, he said. I studied him. Like what? Like planned, he said carefully. I thought it was just how things worked out. I let that sit for a second. Things don't just work out like that, I said. Not with that kind of money, not with that kind of timing. He looked down at his hands again. I know that now. That mattered, more than I expected it to. What did you know back then, I asked. He exhaled slowly. I knew there was a trust, he said. Mom told me before everything was finalized. Before I signed anything. He nodded. She said Grandpa wanted to help me get started, that you were already set, that you didn't need it the way I did. I leaned back slightly. That's the version they told you. Yeah. And you believed it. He hesitated. I wanted to. Honest. At least that was honest. I folded my hands on the table. Did you ever ask why I wasn't part of it? He shook his head. They told me you agreed, he said, that you didn't want the responsibility, that you said it would be better if I had it.
I felt something tighten in my chest again, but it wasn't sharp this time. Just heavy. I never said that, I said quietly. I know. The way he said it flat certain made me look up. When did you realize? I asked. He hesitated longer this time. Not all at once, he admitted. But there were things that didn't make sense. Like what? He ran a hand through his hair like he was trying to organize something messy in his head. The timing, he said. I got access to part of the funds before everything was officially finalized. Dad said it was normal, that it was just how the process worked. I raised an eyebrow. It's not. I know that now, he said quickly. Back then, I didn't question it. I nodded slowly. What else? He glanced around the cafe, lowering his voice slightly. There were emails, he said. I saw one by accident. Mom had her laptop open. It mentioned finalizing Selena's disclaimer before release of funds. I didn't interrupt. I just let him keep going. I asked her about it, he said. She told me it was just legal wording, that everything had already been agreed on. And you let it go. He swallowed. Yeah. There was a long pause. Not tense? Not exactly. Just real. I should have said something, he added quietly. You were 18, I said. You weren't the one making the decisions. That doesn't make it better. No, I agreed. It doesn't. He looked up at me then more directly than he had all night. They're not going to admit it, he said. I know. They'll fight this. I know that too. Another pause. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. There's something else, he said. He unlocked it, scrolled for a second, then turned the screen toward me. A text thread, my mom's name at the top. I leaned in. The messages were old years old, but still there. Denise, make sure you don't bring this up with Selena. Denise, she already signed what she needed to. Denise, we're keeping things simple for everyone. My stomach dropped slightly. Scroll, he said. I did. Denise. Your father handled the paperwork. It's done. Denise. This is what's best for the family. I sat back slowly. There it was. Not just implication. Not just timing. Instruction. Controlled silence. They didn't want you asking questions, he said. No. I replied quietly. They didn't. He locked his phone and set it on the table. I didn't realize how direct it was until today, he said. Hearing everything laid out like that, seeing your documents, it's not the same story anymore. No, I said, it isn't. He nodded. I can't undo what happened, he added, but I can tell the truth. I held his gaze. That's not a small thing. He let out a breath like he'd been holding it for a while. I talked to Collins during the break, he said. I told him I wasn't comfortable supporting their version of events. That surprised me. You already said something. Not everything, he admitted, but enough. I studied him for a second. Why now? He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, because I built everything on top of that money, and if the foundation isn't clean, none of it is. That was the first time he sounded like himself. Not the version shaped by our parents. Not the one who benefited. Just Marcus. I don't want to keep pretending, he said. I nodded slowly. Then don't. Another pause. Shorter this time. More settled. What happens next, he asked. I considered the question. Next, I said, you decide if you're willing to say this in a room with them. With lawyers. On record. He didn't hesitate. Yes. The certainty in his voice caught me off guard. Are you sure? I asked. He nodded. I should have done it 10 years ago, he said. I'm not waiting another 10. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I nodded once. Okay. We sat there for a few minutes after that, not talking much. Just letting things settle. When we finally stood to leave, he hesitated. Selena, he said. Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't answer right away. Because forgiveness wasn't something you give in a moment like that. But acknowledgement mattered. I know, I said. It wasn't absolution. But it wasn't rejection either. And for now, that was enough. As I walked out into the cool evening air, I felt something shift again. The case hadn't been decided. Nothing had been resolved. But the balance had changed, because for the first time, I wasn't standing alone against their version of the story. Marcus had stepped out of it, and once he did that, there was no clean way for them to put it back together. Marcus didn't back out. I half expected him to, not because he wasn't sincere, but because stepping away from a family narrative is one thing. Standing against it on record is something else entirely. But 2 days later, Halpern called me. He's agreed to provide a formal statement, he said, and his attorney is coordinating with Collins. I sat down slowly in my kitchen chair, letting that settle. He's really doing it, I said. Yes, Halpern replied, and it changes the landscape. That was an understatement, because up until that point, this had been about documents, about timing, about interpretation. Now it was about testimony, and testimony forces people to choose a version of the truth. The second conference meeting felt different before it even started. Same room, same long table, but nothing about it felt neutral anymore. Marcus arrived early this time. He sat on my side of the table. That alone said more than any statement could. My parents walked in a few minutes later. My mom noticed immediately. Her expression didn't change much, but I saw it. The flicker, the calculation. My dad's reaction was sharper. Marcus, he said, his voice low but controlled. What are you doing? Marcus didn't move. I'm sitting where I need to, he replied. That was the first crack. Not loud, but visible. Collins cleared his throat, stepping in quickly. Let's all take a seat, he said. We're here to resolve this constructively. No one argued, but the air had already shifted. Halpern opened the meeting without preamble. We've reviewed the additional materials, he said, gesturing toward the documents in front of him, and we understand that Mr. Marcus Boyd would like to make a statement. Collins looked at Marcus, then at my parents. This is unexpected, he said carefully. Marcus didn't wait. It shouldn't be, he said. The room went still. He placed his hands flat on the table, not defensive, not aggressive, just grounded. I was told Selena agreed to give up her share, he said, that it was her decision, that it made sense for the family. My mom shifted in her seat. That's what happened, she said quickly. Marcus didn't look at her. That's what you said happened, he corrected. The difference landed hard. He continued, his voice steady. I never saw her agree to anything. I never heard her say she didn't want it. I just repeated what I was told. My dad leaned forward slightly. You're misunderstanding. No, Marcus said, cutting him off. It wasn't loud, but it was firm. I'm not. Silence. The kind that presses in from all sides. Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out printed copies of the text messages, the same ones he had shown me. He slid them across the table toward Collins. I was told not to talk to her about it, he said, that it was already handled. Collins picked them up, scanning quickly. My mom's face tightened. That's being taken out of context, she said. Marcus finally looked at her. What context makes that okay, he asked. She didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. Halpern stepped in then, calm as ever. These messages, combined with the documented timeline and the revised disclaimer language, create a clear pattern, he said. One that raises serious concerns about whether Ms. Boyd's consent was informed or voluntary. Collins exhaled slowly, setting the papers down. This is becoming more complicated than it needs to be, he said. No, I said, speaking for the first time. It's becoming more accurate. All eyes shifted to me. I held my posture steady. This isn't about misunderstanding, I continued. It's about the fact that a decision was made before I was ever given the chance to make one. My dad shook his head. You're turning this into something it isn't. Am I? I asked. I slid the email chain forward. Because this says otherwise. He didn't touch it. Didn't even look at it this time. Which told me everything. Collins leaned back slightly, his tone more measured now. Let's talk about resolution, he said. Litigation benefits no one here. It damages relationships. It creates unnecessary exposure. Translation, this wasn't as easy to defend anymore. Halpern didn't disagree. Resolution is always preferable, he said. But it has to be based on the full picture. Collins nodded. Of course. He glanced at my parents, then back at us. What would your client consider a reasonable outcome? The question hung in the air. For a second, no one spoke. Because this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not the past, the outcome. Halpern turned slightly toward me. This is your decision, he said quietly.
I felt the weight of that settle in. All of it. The documents, the years, the silence, the betrayal, and now the leverage. I looked at my parents, really looked at them. For the first time, they didn't look certain. They didn't look in control. They looked like people who had expected a story to hold and were watching it fall apart. Marcus sat beside me, still steady, not speaking, but present. I turned back to Halpern. I don't want a quiet settlement that pretends this was okay, I said. Collins nodded slightly like he expected that. Then what do you want, he asked. I paused, because the answer mattered. Not just legally. Personally, I want the trust reevaluated based on my grandfather's original intent, I said. And I want full transparency on how the distribution was handled. My dad let out a sharp breath. That's not realistic. I met his gaze. It is now. Silence again. He looked away first. Collins tapped his pen lightly against the table, thinking. That would require restructuring the existing allocation, he said slowly, and potentially returning a portion of distributed funds. Marcus didn't flinch. My parents did. That's not acceptable, my mom said quickly. It may be necessary, Halpern replied. The tension tightened again. Not explosive, just unavoidable. Collins closed his folder. I think we need time to discuss this privately, he said. Halpern nodded. Of course. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered again. But this time it felt different. Not like a pause. Like a turning point. As we stood, my dad looked at me one more time. You're really going to do this, he said. It wasn't a question. It was something between disbelief and accusation. I held his gaze. I already am. He didn't respond. Just shook his head slightly and walked out. My mom followed. Marcus stayed for a second longer. You did the right thing, he said quietly. I nodded. So did you. When he left, the room felt still, but not heavy. Clear. Because for the first time since this started, the outcome wasn't something they could control anymore. It was something they had to respond to. And that meant the next move wasn't theirs. It was a choice they had to make. Accept the truth or fight it in a way that would expose everything. They didn't drag it into a full trial. That surprised me. Not because they didn't have the resources to fight, it was exactly the opposite. My parents had spent years building a version of themselves that looked controlled, respectable, reasonable. A public case would have cracked that open. And now, with Marcus stepping out of their narrative, the risk wasn't just legal. It was reputational. 3 days after that meeting, Collins called Halpern. By the time I walked into the office that afternoon, the tone had already shifted. They're open to restructuring, Halpern said, sliding a draft agreement toward me. Not an admission of wrongdoing, but not a denial either. I sat down and read. Carefully. The proposal was detailed more than I expected. The trust would be recalculated based on Charles Boyd's original allocation notes. The remaining principal and traceable distributions would be adjusted into a new structure, one that recognized both beneficiaries. Me and Marcus. There was language about administrative oversight and interpretation discrepancies. Nothing that said what actually happened, but everything that mattered was in the structure. What about control, I asked. Halpern nodded slightly. That's the second part. He flipped to another section. A co-managed trust structure, independent oversight, mandatory reporting, no unilateral decisions, no quiet adjustments, no one person controlling the narrative again. I exhaled slowly. And the funds already used, I asked. Partially accounted for, he said. Marcus has agreed to restructure his assets where possible. The rest will be balanced through future distributions. That didn't surprise me. Money once moved rarely comes back cleanly, but this wasn't about reversing time. It was about correcting the trajectory. And your parents, I asked. They're not part of the control structure anymore, Halpern said, by design. That part landed differently, not victory, just final. I looked back down at the document. Every line mattered, every clause, every condition.
This time I didn't skim, I didn't assume, I didn't trust someone else to explain it to me. I read until I understood exactly what I was agreeing to and what I wasn't. Halpern waited, didn't rush me, didn't fill the silence, because this decision, unlike the one 10 years ago, was entirely mine. After a while, I set the pages down. "There's one change I want," I said. He nodded. "Go ahead." "I don't want equal passive distribution," I said. "I want active oversight authority. Financial transparency isn't enough if no one's accountable." He studied me for a second, then gave a small nod. "That's reasonable," he said. "We can adjust for that." It wasn't about control, not the way my parents had used it. It was about visibility, accountability, making sure nothing like this could be hidden again. When the revised draft came back, I read it again. Slower, stronger, clear, then I signed. This time my hand didn't hesitate. We didn't celebrate. There wasn't a moment where everything felt fixed. Because it wasn't. Some things don't go back. They just settle into something different. Marcus and I met once more after everything was finalized. Same cafe, same corner table. But it felt quieter now, less uncertain. "I signed my part this morning," he said. "I know," I replied. We sat there for a minute, both of us understanding that this wasn't just paperwork. It was a reset, not of the past, of what came next. "I meant what I said," he added, "about telling the truth." "I know, and I'll keep doing that." I nodded. "I believe you." That mattered, more than I expected it to, because trust doesn't come back all at once. It rebuilds in small, consistent pieces. "And Mom and Dad?" he asked carefully. I took a breath before answering. "I'm not cutting them out of my life completely," I said, "but I'm not giving them access to decisions that affect me anymore." He nodded slowly. "That makes sense." "It's not punishment," I added. "It's a boundary." The word felt solid, earned. We didn't talk about the past much after that, not because it didn't matter, but because we both knew exactly what it was. And we didn't need to keep reopening it to prove anything. A few weeks later, I found myself back at Halpern's office. Not for a meeting, just to pick up final copies of the documents. Everything was clean now, structured, transparent. The way it should have been from the beginning. As I stood to leave, Halpern said something that stayed with me. "You didn't win because of the documents," he said. I paused. "Then why?" "Because you questioned them," he replied. "Most people don't go back once something feels settled." I thought about that, about how close I had come to never looking at that envelope twice, about how easy it would have been to accept the story I'd been given. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I almost didn't." He nodded. "But you did." That night back in my apartment, I placed the final agreement in a drawer. Not on display, not as a trophy, just where it belonged. Part of my life, not the center of it. I didn't get everything back, not the time, not the version of my family I thought I had. But I got something else. Clarity, control, and the ability to decide what I allow going forward. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Family doesn't lose its power just because we grow up. In some ways, it gets stronger because the expectations follow us into adulthood, shaped by loyalty, obligation, and the quiet pressure to keep things peaceful. But peace without truth isn't peace. It's silence. And silence can cost more than money. What I learned is that boundaries aren't acts of revenge. They're acts of protection. Not just from other people, but from the version of yourself that's willing to accept less, just to avoid conflict. It took me years to understand that questioning something doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you responsible for your own life. And forgiveness isn't the same as access. You can forgive someone and still choose not to give them the same role they had before. You can move forward without pretending nothing happened. If you've ever felt like something in your family didn't add up, like a decision was made around you instead of with you, trust that instinct. Ask the question. Look at the details. Take your time. You don't need to fight loudly to stand your ground. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm and refuse to accept a version of the truth that doesn't match what you see. If this story resonates with you, I'd love to hear your perspective, where you're watching from, what time it is there, and whether you've ever had to set a boundary like this. And if you want more stories like this ones that explore truth, accountability, and quiet strength, feel free to subscribe and stay with me. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.